Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Welcome to episode number 302 of Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. I'm Marcy Larson, Andy's mom. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Emily and Mahaley. And Emily and Mahaley have written a book, but that book will be released this coming September. So you are going to hear all about the book and how that came to be, and some information on how you can follow them and how you can get your book as soon as it's available in September. I really enjoyed the conversation with both of these women because they talk not only about their personal stories, but about their life professionally as well. They both work as perinatal therapists, working with families who have gone through birth trauma or have families in the NICU and things like that. So I thought it was a great conversation just to learn more about that. As a reminder, if you want to share your story with me, certainly email me at marcy@andysmom.com. That's MARCY@andysmom.com. Also, sign up to get the emails weekly so you can see pictures of all these wonderful kiddos, and you can do that by visiting my website, andysmom.com, and also following me on social media where I am always Andy's Mom. Right now, though, I just want you to sit back and enjoy listening to Emily and Mahaley. Thank you so much to my two guests that I'm having on the podcast today. So today I have Emily and I have Mahaley. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear your story and how all of this came to be, your relationship, because it sounds like it's going to be pretty interesting, although I don't know what it is yet. So we are going to start out just by talking to you, Mahaley, because I want to talk about your daughter, Saachi.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about Saachi?
I sure can. Saachi was born in February 2023. She was born on February 2nd. She's my second child, so I had a 6-year-old daughter named Mahaley at the time, who is now 8.5.
Uh-huh.
We had a very kind of run-of-the-mill standard pregnancy, pretty uneventful. A few hours into labor, maybe 2 hours or so, her heart rate dipped. They were able to get it back up. Then I would say about an hour after that, it dipped again. And that time they were not able to get it back up. And so they, in a flurry of chaos, rushed me off for an emergency C-section. They resuscitated her. It took many, many, many attempts, but they were able to get a heartbeat again. And we were at the hospital next to Vanderbilt. We live in Nashville. And the hospital that we were at only had a level 3 NICU, but Vanderbilt down the street had a level 4 NICU. So we were both transferred to Vanderbilt. Saachi was taken to Monroe Carroll Jr. And it was sort of a series of events from there to figure out the extent of the damage that had been done to her. She had gone without oxygen for quite a while. And so for those who may be familiar with that type of process, she was put on a cooling blanket.
Yeah.
She was intubated. She had to be put on the highest support ventilator, and it's the kind that shakes you.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, we were unable to do an MRI to confirm what eventually an EKG, I think on maybe day 2 or 3 showed, which was no brain activity. But you really need that MRI to kind of confirm, because it's a more kind of comprehensive look. And so it was kind of a really unfortunate series of events to let her organs heal enough to be able to take her off of the ventilator to be able to get to the MRI to confirm that she had no brain activity. Her care team said it was some of the most extensive brain damage and just damage to her body in general that they had ever seen.
Wow.
So on the evening of the 5th day, which was on February 7th, she passed away in my arms in the NICU. And, from there, it's been a life-altering journey, ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure. Because she was born on time? Was she full term?
She was born full term. She was born on time. I was 35 during my pregnancy with her.
Mm-hmm.
And I had pretty intense hyperemesis with my first daughter. And so because of that, I was actually, in addition to seeing an OB, I was also seeing an MFM. So I had every test, every scan done under the sun. And we also had some extensive testing done after to make sure that, there was nothing that we missed or nothing that was missed. And fortunately and unfortunately, it was just a freak accident. We are in a 1% of a 1% kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, totally unexpected.
And I would say that's a good way of putting it, fortunately and unfortunately, because you say fortunately because, if you want to go on and there are other pregnancies, you don't think now it's ultra high risk, but unfortunately because, gosh, you just want a reason.
Sure.
Right? To just have to say this is just a crazy fluky thing can be hard to take.
It is hard to take. I think the other side of that too is that there wasn't really any negligence on anyone's part, right?
Yeah.
I proceeded in my pregnancy with her in a way that I felt good about, right? I went to all my appointments, I did all the scans, I did all the things, and her care team did as well, right? Both during the pregnancy and after. And so part of that is, there isn't any one person to blame, right? It's a freak accident. And I think in many ways, that's a good thing. I think that it has maybe shifted some of the anger because there's no one to direct it at. Who, right? It was left up to chance, and it's just a totally freak accident.
Right. And you're right with that too. It's a blessing and yet not in some ways, I feel like in our car accident, I had someone to blame. And then I decided to in turn blame all white BMWs for a long time. I couldn't even stand looking at a white BMW, right? Because a white BMW killed my son. And just seeing people that even looked like the woman who hit us would kind of get me angry and get me upset.
Mm-hmm.
But yet that was so horrible for me to live with that anger that it was really vital in my healing to be able to let go of it. So as much as you want in some ways someone or something to be angry with, at some point in the healing, it's so much better if you can let go of it. So in your case, not having something to pin it on may have been tough at the beginning, but probably for your overall well-being ended up being sort of beneficial.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it's, if I had to choose, right, of option A and option B, and both are obviously horrible.
Horrible options, yeah.
I think I would choose the one that I had, which was that this was just a freak accident and there really isn't anyone to point a finger at.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's hard to be angry all the time too. So.
Yeah.
So you obviously went through all of that, and those days, man, were hard. I'm sure those 5 days of really just not knowing, and and like you said, some people do great. I mean, I've had a family. They actually chose me as their pediatrician because I had a child die, and their APGARs on their child were something like 0.00005 or something. So, and they underwent the cooling protocol and their child ended up doing great. But you just don't know when you're in the midst of it, whether you will be in that percentage that does great or in the percentage who does not recover.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we had, it was probably on day 2. I think there was some hope in those first kind of 48 hours.
Uh-huh.
And then I think after that, we started to really kind of know that we were facing like a pretty terrible outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So And it just sort of, progressively got worse, right? The information that was handed to us. But yeah, I don't think there are really any words that will ever fully be able to describe the intensity of those 5 days, what it was like living them and all of the unknowns, navigating the NICU, the amount of information that's handed over to you, and the amount of decisions that you have to make. Yeah, it's unlike any other experience for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Emily, you have not had a personal experience of loss, but yet this is something that is familiar to you.
Yeah.
Through work and through things like that. So can you talk a little bit about your background too?
Sure. So I'm a therapist that specializes in perinatal mental health. And, through that and working with clients, I've obviously worked with people who have had babies in the NICU and who have experienced loss in the past. So I've read the stories, I've watched the stories because it's been really meaningful for me to connect with those. I've always just really loved learning about people, and that includes hearing the difficult stories. In both my first master's in sociology and my second master's in social work, I definitely during both of those times had an interest in death and dying and took courses in that. And sometimes that looked like working with cancer patients and things like that. But I definitely always had an interest in hearing those stories as well. And so then that kind of came up in the perinatal space. And as I shared with you a little bit before we started recording, I feel like I got a peek. So when my son had a tragic accident involving a tree in 2021, and he was, in the PICU for, actually, it just ended up being a day and a half in the PICU. But when we got there and they wouldn't give him a name because he was a trauma case, they just give you and I don't know the full reason why, if they assume that they might not make it, and that's why, but he just had the name of a state at that hospital, the Children's Hospital. They used states. He was acute Kansas. I felt like, and the doctor came to me, he was like, this could have gone very differently. He had brain injury, multiple facial fractures, all of these things. I don't want to go too much detail, but I felt like, and I remember saying this to Mahaley, one of the first times we talked, that I felt like I was standing on this ridge and I could peek over into the other side that felt like losing him, right? And that it just happened. And it was a freak accident, right? There was no one to blame, same for that. And we just happened, by chance, same thing, to fall back on the side of miraculously somehow he was able to make a full recovery. So I feel like that kind of added to my ability to imagine and empathize and all of those things. My husband and I did have a pregnancy termination, which I count as a loss for myself. I know that doesn't resonate with a lot of people, but that also has increased my empathy around everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think too, with your background of walking beside parents who lose children and then being in that situation, it did make it so you really could envision it more because you had that background of being able to see the people whose children didn't survive. I would say that of other people who may have been in your situation who had their child have a tragic accident and ended up in the peds ICU, they still couldn't imagine it.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that.
Right? Because they have not seen that. No, I'm sure you hadn't thought about it, but it's so funny because I've talked to so many parents, and a lot of them, and then I've talked to David Kessler. I don't know if you've heard, David Kessler's the big, grief guru, and he does a lot of things. And he gets very annoyed by people who say, I can't imagine. And a lot of people do that. I can't imagine. I can't imagine. I can't imagine. And I've had parents say to me, well, try just for a second. And David Kessler has said to me when he was on, he said, you don't have to imagine. You can just look at me. I'm right here. You don't need to imagine. So that's why, you actually then can imagine and did imagine. And many people are scared to imagine. I don't want to imagine. I can't imagine. I don't even want to. But when you say to them for a second, well, just try. For a second, try to imagine and put yourself where I am. Because it's really, when you say I can't imagine, it's like saying I am not going to put myself there. I am not even going to think that could possibly happen to me. We are totally separate. When you imagine it, you now go down in the depths. You now are willing to sit there for a second and look for a second. And even if you get to stop imagining it and go back to your full, complete family, it's still you're willing to go into the space for a little bit, which is saying a lot. So, thank you for that, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about, in our internal parts and the ways that we can experience different things at different times. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. And the hard thing is, like, there's a part of me that still lives on that day that, like, feels like losing him is a chance.
Yeah.
Now, I'm fully grounded in reality for the most part. I'm here, right? But even with all the trauma work I've done, there's still a part of me that, like, even in talking about this, and I'm okay, but, like, it's activating, right? Like, I still feel like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, he's downstairs right now, but, like, yeah, that feels like it's like a very real possibility. It's really interesting. And yeah, like, and I appreciate that life experience for being able to feed connection with other people. I feel like that's important. And my son said the other day, he was appreciative of the incident for being able to, like, realize this certain thing that he went through and he likes talking about it to people.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and all of us, I'm sure, Mahaley, you can attest to this. I mean, a part of you will always be able to relive that day and relive those moments and relive all that time, right?
Oh yeah, it's always there.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe less for me there on that day and more just that a part of me just went with her. It's that part of me is, wherever she is there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can all say that. So why don't you talk now a little bit about kind of how the two of you maybe met or that, because I have no idea, because Emily is in Maryland, Mahaley, you're in Tennessee. This is not like a natural connection of people that would maybe write a book together. So how did this all happen?
Oh, but it is. You just have to, I'll let Mahaley start, but it is.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so I'll rewind. Emily said she's a therapist specializing in perinatal mental health. I am also a therapist specializing in perinatal mental health, and was before my daughter was born and before she died.
Wow.
My kind of focus at that time was in a lot of trauma work, specifically birth trauma work. I do a type of trauma therapy called EMDR. And so because of that, I would see a lot of birth trauma clients. And, we would often do EMDR. We would do, a lot of cognitive processing, et cetera, narrative work. And then at some point, many, many years ago, a colleague and a friend recommended Emily's book, Birth Story Brave, which is now Birth Story Brave Reimagined, but at the time it was just Birth Story Brave to me, and I picked it up and I started using it in session with clients. And I would also have clients that would respond really well to it, and so then they would get the book themselves and they would go through and pick out, sometimes they'd answer all the questions, sometimes they just pick out questions that felt really relevant to them. And it was kind of the first time that I saw firsthand the power of telling your story had in someone's healing journey. And not only that, but also the power that telling your story had in helping these clients see kind of all the parts of their story. Right? So just to give you like a really kind of simple example, right? If I had a client who had an unexpected and unplanned C-section and maybe was, kind of working through some of the expectations versus reality and like hardships of, it not going the way that they wanted it to go, doing some of that work, that story work, and specifically with Birth Story Brave, would allow them to sort of see that like, oh, I had a lot of power in this, or had a lot of agency in this, maybe more than I thought I did. Or my birth, though didn't look like I wanted to, was still really beautiful, right? So that's just kind of an example. So anyways, fast forward to after Saachi died and I decided to go back to work, which at the time felt like such a curse to be working in this population. Like, what am I doing? I knew that I really wanted to tailor my work more towards infant loss, child loss, and working with NICU families. And the book kept popping into my mind as like, oh, I think a book like that in its sort of format and style, but specifically for NICU families, like a very in-depth look at what they go through, whether they lost a child in the NICU or not, right? Whether they got to go home with their baby or not. I think they could really benefit from something like this. And I've also just like, I think I knew that while I had maybe some of the ability to go to the depths that a book like this needed to go, I didn't really want to do it on my own. And I didn't really think that if I just did it on my own, that it would be maybe what I wanted it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found Emily's email website and emailed her and just told her who I was and my idea for the book and told her a little bit about our story. And we met, we Zoomed a few weeks after that, and the rest is kind of history. I'll let Emily take it from there.
Yeah. Well, let's hear your take a little bit, Emily.
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of it picks up there where I received an email from a stranger, which happens sometimes, like after I give a training or, people will kind of reach out to maybe share something or give some feedback. But this one was different. Mahaley seemed to have, she shared about Saachi and their story and seemed to have sort of a vision for like a way we could collaborate. And I'm like, well, this is okay.
Right.
I've never collaborated on a book with somebody and certainly not a stranger. However, it felt really good to hear from her. And I was like, well, I want to, dig into this a little bit and get to know Mahaley. And so, after we talked, even I think like the first time, we were like, okay, so let's like flesh this out a little bit. Let's get started, which is maybe like a little bit nuts, but also felt right. So we went with it. And it really, we're so lucky in that it just like flowed. Like we got a friendship out of it that we weren't like necessarily anticipating. We didn't know if we would get along at all or, her oldest and my youngest are the same age. And so we have kids like that are similar ages and ended up, of course, we have similar careers and some other things in common. And it just like, we were able to like really get a clear outline of what we wanted. And from there, fill it in with how we wanted the book to feel and flow. And it's just been a really seamless process.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So talk about maybe your first book a little bit and then how this one is different and how that kind of changed. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. So the first book, in its first iteration, I wrote right after my daughter, my youngest, was born. I was really feeling like, oh my gosh, like birth is such a huge thing to go through. We talk about it in therapy with clients. I was already specializing perinatal mental health. But as far as like, we have the baby books, but like, where's the book for the person who like went through the thing?
Yeah.
Where's the book for us to really be with all the experiences that we had? Because it's not just a physical event. It is that. And then there's also like, the emotional aspect, the sensory aspect that can kind of like go beyond the physical event. There's the social support aspect, spiritual aspects that come into it. And so I really wanted just like a simple, like kind of a guide. So people would say like, okay, I want to kind of reflect on my experience because it was so big. And from those types of big experiences, sometimes we can tell ourselves, or a lot of times we tell ourselves things, we kind of create a story that isn't necessarily supportive of us. Like, what if we never unpacked that our birth story was different, than we expected, and then we're carrying around this story of failure or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or in other cases where trauma might be present. But trauma doesn't have to be present for story work to be beneficial. And so, I created that guide. And a couple years after that, so that's where the reimagined comes from. I actually took out the word mama because even though it's a word I identify with a lot and many of my readers do, and that's fine and they can use it, I wanted it to be really available to everyone, even if that's not a word that they identify with. And I also added a little section of NICU questions. And so that was actually it was just like, I don't know, 5 to 7 questions or something like that. And that was inspired by my clients because I was like, oh, the NICU experience needs extra. And this feels like a natural place to put that in. And so really, our book follows a similar pattern with like the sections of questions, but it's different because, of course, it really zooms in to the NICU experience. And another thing that's different is that we also include more personal stories. I hadn't done that before. I wanted for people to, there are so many variants in the birth experience. I wanted people to be able to just like kind of ground in and focus on theirs. But the cool thing with this is that, we were able to hear more of like Mahaley's story and her husband, Ravi. And we have another contributor who comes in to share from the queer perspective. And it just is really connecting and beautiful and a nice way to enter into the book. So that's another big difference.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny as I heard both of you talk just about your birth experience being different than expected. It kind of brings me, I just saw a patient just recently who had a new baby. Baby's looking great. Everything's looking great. But going through birth, had pushed for 3 hours. Baby is stuck, had to go to emergency C-section. And the mom said to me, I'm sure this is going to be a lot that I'm going to have to tease out in therapy eventually. Okay. And it's funny because I don't think a lot of people would give her kind of some grace on that and think that might be something that she might have to undergo therapy, because what happened eventually, she had a beautiful baby. I mean, It was a C-section and it may have not have been what they envisioned, but I'm not sure she's getting a whole lot of sympathy from a whole lot of people, having had that. And so it was very funny to hear you talk about that now after I just kind of went through that a little bit with that family, because the reason it came up is, I'm seeing this baby and I said, sounds like you went through a lot the other day, because clearly that wasn't in the plan. You don't push for 3 hours and then have to go to a C-section and all of that. And, and I think that was good to acknowledge it. But I also think it was good that she acknowledged the fact that this may take some real processing at some point in time. But then having said that, you want to go, then there's the whole other experience that you go through all of that trauma as you did, Mahaley, and then you don't get the beautiful baby at the end, right? Now you've experienced the worst, and that's a whole different level. So I think it is kind of nice to have separate things and not try to include everyone in that one single experience. I think that a second book with a different kind of focus is really necessary.
Yeah, and so in your NICU story, we do have, because, of course, some people go take their baby home from the NICU. Some people do, right? So we actually have at the ending, there are sort of 2 different pathways where if you bring baby home, these are the questions you answer. If you don't bring baby home, these are the questions you answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sometimes you bring baby home, but that baby is not, it's not what you expected.
100%.
Right? And you have a whole, I've had so many of these moms on, so many, that they have the 23, 24 weeker, and now they have complication after complication after complication, and they may live into their teens, but they don't ever talk to you, and they don't ever walk, and they don't do all of those things that you hoped and dreamed that they would be able to do, and eventually they don't. You do still outlive them, so that's a whole kind of thing too. So there are people that bring home their babies and they live a relatively normal life. There are infants that come home that do not live a normal life.
Very
and then
much
there are, of
so.
course, the infants that don't come home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all very, very challenging to
Right.
help navigate. So I'm glad that you have kind of different ways to
Mhm.
walk through that for people.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, that was our plan, to kind of help be supportive as much as possible to everyone that we could be.
Mm-hmm. And Mahaley, could you talk a little bit about that decision to kind of go back to work after losing Saachi? I mean, that couldn't have been an easy one to make. And how has that changed you and in your job?
It's ebbed and flowed.
Yeah.
I thought about leaving for a while.
Yeah.
I did take a leave.
Yeah.
It felt kind of extra cruel at first,
Mhm.
of like, oh, okay, so my daughter died. My daughter died unexpectedly. She died in my arms. And now I have to go back to work. For me, working kind of in the perinatal population that I did, I had never had a client with an infant loss.
Oh, really?
No. I worked with a lot of birth trauma clients. I worked with a lot of clients who had had miscarriages and earlier pregnancy losses. I never had a client with an infant loss. And, then a lot of just postpartum challenges and parenting, right? I would say those are kind of the four things. And some infertility as well. But yeah, I didn't think that I could do it. I didn't think that I could go back and kind of listen to just all of the things. And so part of that was that I downsized my caseload.
Mm-hmm.
And truth be told, some clients, sometimes when an emergency and a situation like this happens and you're a therapist, sometimes your clients know and sometimes they don't. At the time, I was at a group practice, and because I didn't have any sense of, left from right, much less when and if I was coming back to work, the owner of the group practice that I was at, with my permission, told my clients what had happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
They all knew that I was going out on leave. And so a few of them chose to not come back to me.
Right.
Because I don't think they could look at someone that, I think that, and some may disagree with me, I think when you're a parent, losing your child is everyone's worst nightmare. I think it is very objectively probably the worst thing that can ever happen to you. And so I do understand from their perspective, right, that relationship between being them and their therapist, and looking at their therapist in the eyes, knowing that they've lived their worst nightmare.
Yeah.
It's like a very odd dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't blame any of them. I think it was a good thing that I was able to kind of downsize my caseload. And then, there were so many moments that I threw my hands up in the air and was like, I'm going to quit. I didn't like this thing that this client said, but I stuck it out. And over time, I'm really glad that I did, because now I actually feel like, whereas before it felt like a curse, I think now it feels really great that I already had my footing in this space, and that I can do work in Saachi's honor. And working is one of the ways in which I spend time with her.
Mm-hmm.
And working in this population, right? And just kind of fine-tuning a little bit what I do, right? My focus now is more on infant and child loss, and working with NICU families, and working with families who go through the various types of trauma in the NICU. So that's not to say that I don't have clients that are outside of that scope. I do certainly have clients that have been with me for many years that chose to come back. But that is kind of my narrower focus.
Well, I can so resonate, because obviously being a pediatrician,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was much in the same boat as my husband is quick to say he went back to work very shortly after Andy died, and he kept saying, you just need to go back to work. Marcy, you just need to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting at home all the time is not good for you. You've got to get back to work. And so I did. I went back to work, and it was horrible. It was so incredibly hard, because, and all my families knew, right? And they all look at you
Mm-hmm.
with that same
That look.
sad kind of look
Mm-hmm.
that makes you want to cry. I cried between every single patient.
Mm-hmm.
It was horrible. I just could not do it. I mean, I very distinctly remember, I think the last day I went in, we have parents do surveys ahead of time. And it was for, I think, a 2.5-year-old that I was supposed to be seeing. And on the survey, the mom was complaining that he kept getting up in the middle of the night and going to their bedroom, which is a pain. I know this. I mean, I raised 3 young kids. It is painful. You want to sleep. You want them to sleep. You want everyone to sleep. But that day I was like, I cannot talk to you about that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot tell you how much I would give to have Andy wake me up in the middle of the night, and he will never do that again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I just couldn't. So some of those types of normal parenting things that I used to be able to talk about all the time, I just couldn't. It just was so painful to see these whole families, and mine was so broken. And again, just like you said, I had families that left and never came back because they don't want to have a pediatrician whose kid died.
No.
Because honestly, like, what's your biggest job as a mom? Your biggest job is to keep your kid alive.
Mm-hmm.
And all I kept thinking to myself was, you know, and I couldn't do that. Right? What kind of pediatrician am I if I can't even keep my own child alive? Like, how am I going to be able to help other families? So I feel like I so resonate with you. I mean,
Yeah.
So, you know, so I tried that for a few weeks. It was a disaster. I had to leave. I did some administrative work, but it took a full year for me to really come back, and a lot of therapy. I mean, a lot of therapy. And I remember seeing my therapist, and I said to her that day, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I said that to a lot of people, like, I can't do this. I can't be a pediatrician with a dead child. And I remember her looking at me and saying, if you want to, we will get you back. But it was also nice that she said, if you want to, she gave me that permission to say, no, this isn't what I want to do anymore. And, you know, we did a lot of EMDR, so I'm well familiar with that. You talking about that. But it, you know, in general, like over a year later, I was able to go back. And I think now, kind of as you said, is now I am better at my job than I used to be in many ways.
Yeah. I think the same.
I know pain in a way that I didn't before, and I can empathize in a way I wasn't able to before.
Yeah,
right?
I relate to that. I think it's shifted my work in a very positive direction, for sure.
Right. And it's something that you don't want to like think about and admit right away. I don't want to say, oh my word, thank goodness Andy died because I became a better pediatrician because of it. I would never in a million years say that. I would much rather be the pediatrician I was and have all of my children living, because I don't think I was a bad pediatrician. But if it had to happen, I'm glad there could be some blessing from it. Right?
Yeah, I relate to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we are very much on the same page as far as that goes. And it does change your practice a little bit and how things are. And even though I see a lot of the same kids, you know, I was saying earlier that I see people whose kids have been through some birth trauma and have done some different things. I certainly have told my office, if we ever get a new family, which I have one family, we ever get a new family whose first child died of SIDS, whose first child died of anything, and now they're having more kids and they want to come in, I need to be their doctor, no one else. And not that they can't be, but I just have a different perspective, right? When that family comes in, we talk about that older brother all the time. Before I had a loss, I had some families who lost children. I would avoid that subject. Like, why would they want to talk to me about their child who died? I didn't bring that up. Now I know that's the opposite. They absolutely want to talk about that, need to talk about that, especially if they get to that point where their living child is reaching that age that the other one was when they died, now passing that age. These are all big things to talk about, and a super important part of now trying to parent after having loss. I mean, it's completely different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Parenting after loss is its own.
Right. It's its own thing.
That's its own bucket.
I don't know. Have you had to deal with that much yet? Talking to parents after loss?
Yeah, I have quite a few clients now that I work with that have lost children. I also just held my first stillbirth and infant loss group. And so a number of the women in that group, are either parents to other living children when their loss happened, or have gone on to have more kids. And I have had more kids since Saachi died. So that's its own, it is like its own thing, right? It's its own, at times, unfortunate, I think, domino effect of losing a child is that it really shifts how you parent, and how you think about your children, how you view them, and how you also just are so aware. I think they're just very acutely aware, maybe in a different way, of the fragility of their life.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it has happened to me before. So that really means that it can happen again. And so many people live kind of wanting to live in this fantasy land that children don't die, and that your children will grow up and you will die before they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why I think my story, because it was such a freak accident and nothing could have been done to prevent it, I feel like sometimes it's almost harder for people to hear, because they're not able to say like, oh, well, I just won't do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I just won't do, I just won't do this. I just won't do that. It makes it harder to, stay in your bubble, I guess.
For sure. Because it's so much easier to, if you can have something to blame or someone to blame, I know with me, there was a question like, well, did he have a seatbelt on? Of course he had a seatbelt on. Of course he did. But they want to be able to say, well, he didn't have a seatbelt on. I always keep my kids in the seatbelt, so this couldn't happen to me.
Yeah.
It can happen to you. And you can do everything like right and have it still happen to you.
Yeah.
Emily, you talked a little bit too about like classes and trainings that you do. Could you talk a little more about that?
Oh, sure. Those are usually for therapists. I have offered some workshops for birth professionals outside of that before. And I've offered like in-person birth story reflection, like story work, things like that. But generally, the trainings I offer are for therapists to kind of teach them how to do this work, like to do story work, and to, our main goal, and it's our goal with this book, is to expand the story to let all of its parts in. And we don't want to erase the hard parts, but we also want to let in the other stuff that might, like gratitude or beauty or something like that are also part of the story, and let all of it be together. So really helping therapists understand how to, use the tools that I offer to like do that, or use their own tools if they choose,
I love that, because I've worked with lots of people now. I've talked with lots of bereaved parents over time, and there are lots of therapists that are really bad with grief.
I know. It makes me so sad to know that. And I think I don't know why I was interested in grief even before I became a therapist. I don't know. Like I just was. But I think some of us kind of gravitate towards being, after I graduated with my social work degree, I worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital with heart transplant patients. So grief has always been, and some of those patients survived and it was wonderful. Some did not. And so like grief has always been something that has been kind of like close by in my work.
Yeah.
We also weren't afraid to talk about grief in my family growing up. Maybe that helps too.
Wow. I think probably. Yeah.
Yeah. My parents didn't pretend that they weren't sad or shove things under the rug. Like they were open about their emotions. And so I think that I wanted to be a similar presence for people who might not have that otherwise in their lives.
Well, and socially, I think it is something that's really often swept under the rug and you're not supposed to talk about. I would say even more with miscarriage, stillbirth, like when they're young. I mean, so much of the time it seems like the advice that people get is, well, you can have another baby.
Exactly. Like, don't pay attention to that, or just be happy that you got to bring your baby home. In the case of like NICU, if you bring your baby home, don't think about your time in the NICU. Just focus on this. And none of that's really helpful. I know a lot of people are well-meaning in saying that.
Yeah.
But it leaves this whole voice unspoken. And so that's my second or third birth story held for loss is all around perinatal loss. And so like that's for those stories. But yeah, like you're so right. A lot of times there's not this allowance, this permission to just be in your grief and to know that there's no timeline on it and that you might dip back into it and it's going to be louder at sometimes than others. And Mahaley calls them grief days. And I want to say that that's kind of the language that I've used too. The grief that I've dealt with recently is different, about having aging parents and saying goodbye to my childhood home. That's different grief, but it's still grief. But, having the days that are big, like it comes in and that's okay. And how cool would that be as like a society if we were able to make an allowance for that?
Yeah. I think back to a family that I have had for many, many years. It actually was early in my practice. I had a new baby, had been a 23-week preemie, came out of the NICU, and was the only surviving triplet. And mom had pictures of the other two up in the house, and dad really was very insistent that those pictures needed to come down, that they had one living child and they needed to focus on that living child, and they needed to kind of forget that there were triplets. And ultimately their marriage broke apart, and which probably ended up being for the best. But it's just interesting how different people just have different ways of handling that, and how that dad's way of handling it was, let's just forget about those other two and focus just on the one. And the mom couldn't do that. And you shouldn't do that. She should never be asked to pretend like she only had a single birth when there had been three.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like that's where he was in his grief, and
right,
that she was, yeah, exactly.
At a different point. And it's just difficult and challenging, I think, when different people are in different spots. And then, like I said, so many therapists I don't think you get great training just in school for social work or counseling or whatever kind of degree you get. I don't know that there is a lot on grief and being with people. I don't know. Maybe it's getting better. Who knows?
I mean, it depends so much on the program, right? So I'm trying to think back. So I definitely had a death and dying course in my MSW, but that's, I sought it out, right? It wasn't required.
Right. It wasn't a required course, but it was something that you did because you had interest in it.
Right. And I did a lot. I had sort of a focus, like there was the mental health stuff, but I also had like a medical health focus. And so we talked a lot about like chronic illness in children. And so that probably gives me a little bit of a different perspective. But Mahaley I'm a social worker. Mahaley's a counselor. So maybe Mahaley, you can speak to, and every program's different, of course, but.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, so yeah, my credentials are LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist.
Oh, sorry. I totally.
No, that's fine. There's generally like LCSW, LMFT, LPCC, right? And they're all kind of different. LMFT is really more, you kind of learn how to look at things from a very like systemic approach in terms of like families. There wasn't any training that sticks out in my mind in grad school as being really kind of grief oriented or profound in that way. I've had a number of friends or friends of friends over the years who have thought about, going back to grad school and asked me my thoughts, my advice, am I happy in this career, all these different things. And again, this is only specific to my program, and I always tell them your program may be different. I think that you should expect that grad school will give you a really good foundation. And anything outside of that, anything you're wanting to really learn or focus on is going to have to come from not only firsthand experience, so just kind of diving in the deep end and working with clients and working with that population, but also any additional training that you want to go through. But, so Emily and I are both certified in perinatal mental health. So for that certification, there's all continuing education, right? And that you always have to do. We have to do continuing education for that as well. And, I still find some of the trainings that I've done to like get my continuing education credits, I still find some of them problematic. I'm like, that is not true. Or I can tell that was not written by someone who has lost a child.
Yes.
So there's a lot of work to be done for sure, I think, not just in our population, in our field, but in all fields probably.
And I would say, me personally, I've said this on the podcast before. I mean, how much training did I have as a doctor? Zero. Absolutely zero. Nothing.
Yeah.
You're just supposed to, I don't know how you're supposed to handle it. Like, you're being with these patients who are dying or patients whose children are dying, and you kind of just look at the attending that you're working with and see what they're doing and, maybe follow that. But there's nothing to rely on. I mean, I've told this story many times that when I was in college, my mom died and no one told her she was dying until I was there by myself with her, and nurses took me out and said, your mom could die at any time. You shouldn't be here alone. And we had no clue she was dying. And so then I had to go in and be the one to tell her she was dying. And at that point in time, I knew I was going to medical school. I mean, I hadn't been accepted yet, but it was middle of my junior year. So I knew that was my goal. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, those nurses and doctors really screwed up. They did not do what they were supposed to do. Clearly, I'm going to learn, and I am not going to do that. And yet, then I go on, and I get all the way through my training, and I didn't really think about the fact that I didn't learn and that I wouldn't have done better. And when faced with it, did I do better? I mean, I didn't do as bad as they did, right? I never made a college girl tell her mom that she was dying. But did I handle it right? No, I 100% didn't handle it right. Not until I had gone through the death of Andy did I realize how to do it right and when to do it right. And so now I do some training. Eric, my husband, and I do some training at different medical schools and residencies and talking to people. But again, I have to tell you, the most recent one we did, we went to speak at a grand rounds at pediatrics, and all of the social workers that worked in the pediatrics department came. Some of the residents, maybe 25%. Some of the attendings, maybe some of them who knew us. But overall, I was so disappointed, right? Because this is a choice you make to go to that grand rounds and to learn those kind of skills. But again, so many of those people at that hospital, they didn't think it was important. I don't know, but they weren't there and they didn't show up. And I think, gosh, that's just not good. So we go back to you, Emily. You had to seek out that death and dying course. It wasn't something that was mandatory. These grand rounds, they weren't mandatory for you to go and learn about, because we named the talk Grief, What You Never Learned in Medical School. And you would hope that they might say, okay, this is something intriguing. But instead they're thinking, do I want to spend my lunch listening to people talk about death and dying? No, I don't. So I'm just not going to. And it's just not good. I mean,
No.
These are people that deal with this professionally that should realize that this is important, but they don't.
Absolutely. And I don't know how, one thing I don't know is how to make people kind of wake up to that. I don't know.
I know.
Sometimes the wake up things are like the personal experiences and
Right.
the things that
That's
you just
so
wish you're like,
terrible.
if you could only know before, those things happen. And
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, Yeah, I know. I did one that was mandatory for all third-year medical students, and that's maybe what I need to do. You need to get
Mandatory trainings.
in front of a group of people that they just have to be there. I mean, they just have to listen to me talk for an
Right.
hour. Because actually, most of those people, and most of the people that go, do give us really positive feedback, like that they're really glad that they went. It's funny, my husband talked with an orthopedic surgeon, and we did orthopedic surgery grand rounds, we did ER grand rounds, and I think it was pretty close to mandatory that you had to go. And which I don't like that they had to be there, but in some ways it's better that they had to be there, because when you give them an absolute choice, whether you can go if you want, you don't go if you want, so many people just choose not to do it because they just don't think it's really relevant or that important, or I'm not sure. They just don't want to think about it. I think a lot of it's that, a lot of people are parents. They don't want to think about their child dying. So if they don't listen to you, then they don't really even have to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know we're not going to solve this today.
No.
Unfortunately not.
No, I wish we
So
could.
tell people how they can get a hold of your book and maybe what the reception has been like since that has been.
So it's launching in September, so there hasn't.
Oh, so you've got time.
We've gotten fantastic feedback from our beta readers, which is wonderful. So, people who are doing kind of like the pre-reading of the book, offering their feedback and suggestions, which was wonderful, and we're very grateful. But it comes out September 15th. You'll be able to get it wherever books are sold. But for now, yournicustorybook.com is our website. And that's for people to learn more about the book and to also follow along as we share pre-sale information and things like that.
Okay. Perfect. And and everyone should just put it on their calendar right now, that September 15th, so that they know, because I'm sure it'll be available on Amazon and things like that, right?
Yep. And you should be able to get it at like local bookstores if you want to do that, or, Barnes and Noble, things like that. It should be available everywhere at that point.
But I love that you're giving people information on that website that they can go to and kind of follow along.
Exactly.
So be a bit, maybe not a beta reader, but a bit of an insider as to know what's going on. So thank you so much to both of you for coming on and sharing your stories. And I love to be able to learn more about Saachi and just about all the great work you guys are doing. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening. If you found this helpful and would like to support the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and comment. To help financially, you can type Andy's Mom, one word, to the number 53555. This provides a link to GiveButter, which allows donations through PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay, or credit cards. GiveButter will provide a receipt of your tax-deductible donation. Or you can visit the donation page at andysmom.com/donate. Always Andy's Mom is a registered 501c3 and can receive donations through Thrivent Financial and Benevity. Marcy loves hearing from listeners. Please feel free to reach out to her via email at marcy@andysmom.com or on the Instagram or Facebook Always Andy's Mom accounts. Sign up for the email list to get weekly episode links as well as pictures of Marcy's guests and their children. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.